Good day. Last 24 hours have seen some fairly dramatic developments in the Ukrainian conflict, though it's not entirely clear what their overall significance is. But the interesting thing about these developments is that they've all taken place principally in Munich, where the Munich Security Conference is underway, and that they don't relate directly to events on the battlefields. There's actually been less news over the last 24 hours about what is going on the battlefields, but such news as there is suggests that the Russians continue to hold the initiative and continue to advance. Now, there's been some reports, in fact, I think they're more than reports, I think it's perhaps information, that having captured Paraskovivka, the Russians are now indeed pushing forward towards the next village, a place called Berchova, and once they've captured that, they will be apparently in a position to cut the last remaining road, main surfaced road leading into Bakhmut from Chasov Yar. At that point, all of the roads leading into Bakhmut will have been cut, that is to say, occupied by the Russian forces. Now, I want to stress that does not mean that it would be impossible for Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut to withdraw from there, or indeed impossible for Ukraine to send more soldiers into Bakhmut. They can still do it, as I've discussed before, as many people have discussed before, across open fields and country roads and that kind of thing. But, as I've also said, trying to sustain a force of thousands of men engaged in intense combat by trying to keep them supplied via country roads and across open fields is a logistical nightmare. And in a situation where those country roads and those fields could be the target of Russian artillery strikes, it's an even worse nightmare. It's not something which I think any military commander would ever want to put his troops through. But that's the kind of scenario we might soon be finding ourselves in if Ukraine continues to refuse to withdraw its troops from Bakhmut. And perhaps predictably, in light of these latest developments, and I should, by the way, quickly add that so far as I'm aware, the Ukrainian authorities have not formally confirmed the capture by the Russians either of Krasnaya Gora or of Paraskovivka, the two villages to the north of Bakhmut, which the Russians have just captured over the last couple of days. Well, inevitably, perhaps, despite the failure to admit to the capture of these villages, there are reports now appearing again on Ukrainian telegram channels that General Zelensky, the Ukrainian commander, the military commander, is now once again pressing President Zelensky to pull Ukrainian troops out of Bakhmut. And these latest reports seem to suggest that Zelensky this time has come to a realization that this is now inevitable if these troops are not going to be trapped, but that he's still playing for time. He's still unwilling to give the order, and that supposedly he's waiting for President Biden to arrive in Poland to give his speech there, a speech which US officials tell us will be addressed to the Russian people and to President Putin personally. An interesting combination, by the way. We'll see exactly what it means. It might suggest some sort of olive branch, but I'm not going to assume that until it happens. But anyway, that President Zelensky is trying to hold on to Bakhmut until President Biden has arrived in Poland, delivered his speech, whatever that speech says, and then perhaps a decision to withdraw from Bakhmut will be made. In fact, there's been another report, also from another Ukrainian channel, that to the extent that it still can, Ukraine is still feeding troops into Bakhmut. A couple of days ago, I said that I thought that Ukraine might be pulling out of Bakhmut. As I said later, the wish was to some extent the father to the thought. I hope that Ukraine was finally making rational decisions about the state of this battle. It seems that was wrong. And again, we've seen more reports that, in fact, far from pulling out of Bakhmut, Ukraine is still sending troops, apparently not very well trained troops. It's still trying to feed them in to Bakhmut, at least according to some of these reports, which, if true, I have to say, seems to me not just extraordinary, but wrong at many ethical and moral levels as well. Anyway, that's where we are on the situation in Bakhmut. Now, I should say that there's been two rather interesting analyses of the situation, and I want to stress these are analyses of the situation. They're not actual reports as such, but they're analyses of the situation which have appeared on the Slavyangrad Telegram channel. Now, I want to repeat again, Slavyangrad is a strongly pro-Russian channel. It supports Russia in the war. I have consistently found, however, that its reports are reliable, and I would also add that I find that its military analyses have been frequently very insightful. Anyway, one of these analyses says that once the Russians have actually finished the encirclement of Bakhmut, that will not be the end of the Battle of Bakhmut by any means. In order to consolidate that encirclement, the Russians will have to push outwards. In other words, they will have to push Ukrainian forces which are not located within this cauldron or bag or whatever you want to call it. They will have to push those Ukrainian forces further away so that they cannot interfere in the fighting in Bakhmut itself, that they can't come to the aid of the troops, Ukrainian troops, trapped in Bakhmut, and that there's no real prospect, therefore, of the Ukrainians launching a successful breakout or break-in to Bakhmut to try to either rescue the troops trapped there or perhaps to withdraw them. And I think that's probably true. I'm not, as I said, a person with much understanding of military strategy. I would simply say that if it is true, then this might be a fairly tough fight that the Russians still have ahead of them, given that apparently the terrain west of Bakhmut, where the Russians would be advancing, is, as we've been told, quite hilly, and that the Russians would presumably be having to push the Ukrainians back from high ground which they control. So it may be that this fight, even once Bakhmut is fully encircled, is going to continue for some weeks before we see a final decision as to what happens, a final end to the fighting there. I would also say, however, that if that is right, then logically, by the time the Battle of Bakhmut does end, the Russians will be in control of at least some of this high ground, and we've seen Ukrainian officers themselves admit that that would put the Russians in a position to look down upon the remaining Ukrainian positions further west in Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, and to sight their artillery in a better position where they can more effectively shell these two towns. Anyway, I'm not saying that this is necessarily correct. I found it an interesting and insightful analysis. I've tended to find these analyses that Slavyangrad publishes from time to time very interesting. And by the way, there's also been a very interesting second analysis on the same website, on the same Telegram channel, Slavyangrad, about the fighting in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area. And it suggests that it is a misconception to think of the Russians taking the offensive in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area. The point it is making is that Svatovo and Kremenaya were supposed to be the objectives that the Ukrainians set themselves when they launched their Kharkiv counteroffensive back in September. They were going to capture places like Balaklia, Izium, Kupiansk, Liman, all of which they did, and then they were going to press on and capture Svatovo and Kremenaya, which was supposed to interfere or interrupt or break Russian supply lines to their groupings in Donbass. And I was skeptical at the time about whether, if Svatovo and Kremenaya were indeed captured by the Ukrainians, it would have quite the impact that the Ukrainians imagined. But I don't think there's any real doubt that that was actually the Ukrainian plan. I say that because at the time I read lots of reports to that effect in the British media, and I recall that a couple of weeks ago, before the New Year, some weeks before the New Year, when already the fighting on all the fronts had stabilized and it began to look as if the various Ukrainian offensives had begun to peter out, I remember reading an account, a report in several British newspapers that the Ukrainians were about to capture Svatovo. And of course that didn't happen, and we've had no reports recently that either Svatovo or Kremenaya are about to be captured by Ukraine, even though both of these two towns are very close indeed to the front lines. They're about 5 kilometers behind the front lines, or 7 kilometers in some cases. Well, what this analysis is saying is that that was the Ukrainian plan. The Ukrainians mobilized large numbers of men to try and capture these two towns. They hit a brick wall because the Russian defenses began to strengthen as attacks on these two towns Ukrainian attacks on these two towns started to intensify. The Ukrainians were unable to break through and were unable to capture these two towns. And since then, as pressure on the Ukrainian front lines across the entire line of conflict has increased, the Ukrainians have been obliged to pull some troops away from the Svatovo-Kremenaya area to enforce their front lines in other places, in Zaporozhye and Vuhledar, wherever. And that has enabled the Russians to launch counterattacks. But this is not part of a Russian plan to go on an offensive in this specific area. It's more a case of trying to strengthen Russian defenses in this area. In other words, in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, the Russian position is still essentially a defensive one. I think this is probably a correct analysis. I think this is in accord with what I've been seeing of the fighting that's been going on here. The Russians have indeed pushed the Ukrainians back, but the Ukrainians still remain very close to both Kremenaya and Svatovo. There's no real sign here of a big Russian offensive, and the main activity, the main offensive activity of the Russian forces in this part of the battlefront is some way north along the towards Kupiansk, which is some distance away from the battles that are taking place in this particular area. I'm going to make a suggestion that we will probably see Russian offensive moves in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area when the Russians have finally ended the fighting in Bakhmut, captured Bakhmut, perhaps captured the high ground to the west of Bakhmut, position their artillery so that they can shell more effectively Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And once the Russians have also cleared out Ukrainian forces from Seversk, this town to the north of Bakhmut, the northern end of the so-called Zelensky line, which is very much a part of the Ukrainian defences, and which I am sure will become an important Russian objective fairly soon, perhaps once the fighting in Bakhmut has achieved, shall we say, some kind of breakthrough. Anyway, I found both of those analyses quite interesting. As I said, I'm not saying that they're definitely correct, but I pass them on because they do give perhaps some kind of insight into what's going on those particular battlefronts. And I would finish by saying that there's been two further reports. One is that there have been large numbers of Russian troops apparently spotted arriving in Melitopol. Now, this could be for any number of reasons. By the way, the reports claim that these are Wagner assault groups. They might be assault troops. They might be, or they could be Russian regular army. People always report, I think, now see Wagner pretty much everywhere, in part because of the enormous publicity Yevgeny Prigozhin has given to it. But anyway, that there's been large numbers of Russian troops appearing in Melitopol, and it's been suggested that this is all in preparation for some further attack or offensive in Vuhledar, or perhaps further west in Zaporozhye, or perhaps, and this is just my suggestion, it's to strengthen further Russian defences in this area in anticipation of the long talked about Ukrainian offensive towards Melitopol. Who's to say? There has been, or at least there are reports of, a Ukrainian counterattack near Donetsk city in the Avdiivka area, that the Ukrainians have been trying to push Russian forces away from Avdiivka. Again, it's very difficult to get very much information about what exactly is going on near Avdiivka. Some Russian reports say that there was such an attack, but that it was pushed back. And one senior official of the Donetsk regional government seemed to predict, this is the Russian-appointed Donetsk regional government, the Donetsk People's Republic government, to be more precise. He appeared to think that the battle for Avdiivka is pending, and he also, by the way, said that it will be the decisive battle in the battle for Donbass. Perhaps when he says the decisive battle, he means the big culminating end battle. Well, we will see. But anyway, that's the situation as far as I can glean it from the battlefronts. Now, let's get on to what's been happening at the Munich Security Conference. To remind everyone, the Munich Security Conference is a big jamboree in which all the various top people, many top people from the West come, the Western countries come. Rishi Sunak is there. President Macron, France, is there. Chancellor Scholz is there. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, is there. The United States is represented by its vice president, Kamala Harris. She was there as well. And another person who's been there, the spectre at the feast, if I can put it like that, and I'll explain why I'm describing him in that way in a moment, is Wang Yi. Now, Wang Yi, until a few months ago, until the latest party congress in China, was China's foreign minister. Now, he's been replaced in that position, and that's what I was reading in a lot of Western media outlets, but that was actually misleading because Wang Yi has not actually been replaced. He has effectively been promoted. He's been put in charge of a Chinese Communist Party, or a committee of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China Commission that supervises foreign policy, and he's been given a place on the Politburo of the Communist Party of China, the CPC. So actually he's been promoted. He's now been put in a position where he is not just an executive fulfilling the Chinese government's foreign policy decisions, something which he did extremely well, by the way, but he's now become a member of China's key policy-making decision bodies, the Politburo. He's not, as I understand it, a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is the absolute highest body in the decision-making process in China. But anyway, he's a member of the Politburo. He's heading a position within the Central Committee. He's actually, as I said, been significantly promoted, and he's now clearly not just carrying out Xi Jinping's and the Chinese government's instructions, and he's not just an advisor, he's now an active and important policy maker, which, given his ability and experience, is unsurprising. And he's turned up at the Munich Security Conference, which, as I said, is a place where Western leaders like to gather every year at around this time. And the Munich Security Conference has been, on occasion, the venue of quite dramatic events. Perhaps the most famous is one which took place in 2007, when President Putin, when he was still being invited to these sort of conferences. Anyway, President Putin attended and delivered what might have been the single most important speech made by any political leader so far this century, in which he openly criticized the unipolar policies of the United States, said that they were the source of international tension, said that they were unsustainable, and made clear Russia's opposition to them. And it's fair to say that Putin has never been forgiven by the Western foreign policy establishment for that speech. You only have to see film of it to see the faces of the various Western leaders listening to Putin making that speech, Senator McCain being in the front row, for example. But anyway, it was a speech which perhaps broke the taboo on discussing this subject that had existed amongst the major powers, questioning the dominant position that the United States had achieved after the Cold War and the dominant position that the Western powers had achieved after the Cold War. And for that reason, it must be treated as a seminal speech. Well, there have been other important events at the Munich Security Conference, but perhaps the one that stands out for me is the extraordinary conduct of many of the participants last year. Now, at that time, the Russians were already effectively excluded, and all the Western leaders were there. Scholz was there, Baerbock was there, Boris Johnson, who was still Prime Minister of Britain, was there, and Kamala Harris was also there. And I have to say, up to that time, up to this point when this conference was taking place, I've been one of those people who'd been skeptical about whether there would be a war in Ukraine. But I have to say, whilst I was watching the conference taking place, all the various speeches, my heart sank, because it seemed to me that all of the leaders, all the Western leaders, were competing with each other to take the most extreme positions, the most maximalist positions. So was President Zelensky of Ukraine, who also attended and delivered an extraordinary speech in which he seemed to play with the idea of Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons, something which alarmed the Russians. I'm not, to this day, sure how serious Zelensky really was about that, but it is also the case that no Western leader pushed back against this. But anyway, it was an extraordinary spectacle. It was, as I said, one Western leader outdoing the other. And I have to say, I came away from following the Munich Security Conference with a deep sense of foreboding, the one last year, with a deep sense of foreboding, a feeling that things were running out of control, and that these people were actually enjoying themselves, that they were looking forward to the crisis that was pending with Russia, that they were itching, almost, some of them, for the crisis, because this was going to be their opportunity to throw off all restraints, to hit at the Russians, as they had been aching to do for a long, long time, and that they were confident that once that happened, well, they would achieve whatever grandiose objectives they were expecting, which, to my mind, indisputably included regime change in Moscow. There's been a recent admission by Ursula von der Leyen, the EU, the president of the European Commission, that the EU was preparing its sanctions for at least 2 months before the start of the war. And apparently this wasn't just being talked about, it was being undertaken in immense detail. Seymour Hersh has published his article about how planning in the United States for the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines was already in advanced preparation by the time of the Munich Security Conference last year. Anyway, I am sure that the expectation was that there would be these enormous sanctions imposed on the Russians in response to the Russian intervention in Ukraine, which everybody by this time was not just expecting, but planning for, and I would say personally provoking, intentionally provoking, and that this would cause a huge crisis in Moscow, that there would be hyperinflation, that the ruble would collapse, that industrial production in Russia would collapse, that the country would rapidly run out of money, and that President Putin would fall. And in fact, we had a few weeks later, not many weeks later, a speech from President Biden in Warsaw, in which he openly called for regime change in Moscow, spoke about the ruble being at 200 to the dollar, which absolutely wasn't the case at the time. And we've just heard President Macron give a speech at the Munich Security Conference, which I discussed, at my video in my video yesterday, in which he said that he didn't believe in regime change in Moscow, that he thought that was a disastrous and misconceived idea, that that was never going to happen, and that if it did happen, which was inconceivable, the outcome might not be good for the West. And I suggested yesterday in my video that what Macron was effectively doing was confirming that there had been a discussion about regime change, that was indeed the plan, and he's now coming forward and saying, in the way that he likes to do, I told you so, it hasn't worked out, and it hasn't really happened as we expected. And it's been fascinating to contrast the mood, the somber mood at the Munich Security Conference this year with his delirious mood, I call it delirious, that we witnessed last year. Now, in case you think I'm the only person to talk in that way, let me first of all go to an article that's appeared in Politico. Now, it's very careful, this article is very careful to hedge itself a little, but its headline is already apocalyptic. It's the end of the world as we know it, and Munich feels nervous. If even the Germans are worried about the world's perils, this could be the moment to really start worrying. That's the subtitle. And then we go on to read, I'm not going to read the whole article, by the way, but it goes on to say, cut through the haze of hoary proclamations emanating from the main stage of the Munich Security Conference about Western solidarity and common purpose this weekend, and one can't help but notice more than a hint of foreboding just beneath the surface. Even as Western leaders congratulate themselves for their generosity toward Ukraine, the country's armed forces are running low on ammunition, equipment, and even men. Ukrainian President Zelensky, who opened the conference from Kiev on Friday, urged the free world, extraordinary to see that expression come back, by the way, the free world to send more help, and fast. We need speed, he said. And then the rest of it, I'm afraid, doesn't quite follow. The rest of the article doesn't quite follow those introductory words. It retreats into the usual cliches about, the West and Ukraine being arm in arm against aggression and all that. But anyway, you get the drift. You get the sense of what the author, who's presumably actually in Munich, really feels. In fact, the article is actually basically says that it's from Munich. Anyway, that is actually written in Munich. Anyway, one gets the sense that this is how this person sees events at the Munich conference. It's, by the way, just to say, the journalist is a person called Matthew Kartnischnik. Somebody I don't know, but anyway, he's in Munich, and you get the sense of what he thinks the mood is like there. It is nervous, he tells us. There's a sense of foreboding. Everybody's saying in hushed words to each other, it's the end of the world as we know it. And that's Politico. Let's go to another Western newspaper, which has also been incredibly fierce about the war, and it's The Guardian. It's been unstinting in its support of Ukraine. It's gone, if possible, further in its support of Ukraine than any other British newspaper. And of course, it's becoming clear in its editorial. I said The Guardian, technically it's an editorial from The Observer, but The Observer and The Guardian are now part of the same media group, and the Observer and the Guardian share a website, and the Observer is, to all intents and purposes, the Guardian's Sunday newspaper, Sunday version of the newspaper. But anyway, you can see there in this editorial the doubts are there. There's an awful lot of cliches again, a lot of talk about the heroism of Ukraine, the incompetence of President Putin, the incompetence of the Russian military. But then it goes on to say, it is plain the war is far from over and may be entering an even more dangerous phase. Russia's ill-led, ill-equipped and ill-disciplined forces, I said it's full of cliches, have regrouped and reinforced. Their anticipated spring offensive along the eastern or southern fronts, or possibly via Belarus, may already be gathering pace. And Moldova, where there is a political crisis, by the way, and where the president is trying to blame the Russians for it, that's a topic Alex Christoforou and I will discuss on the Duran. But anyway, and Moldova is also threatened with destabilization. It has been clear for some time that Ukrainian forces are on the back foot in key strategic locations. Despite more pledges of sophisticated Western arms, missile systems and tanks, they are reportedly struggling to hold back the invaders. Almost 100 US, European and NATO leaders meeting at this weekend's Munich Security Conference appear to understand a critical moment is approaching. Zelensky is demanding urgent action to help Ukraine weather the coming storm. Rishi Sunak is listening, and then, we're going to turn to the British in a moment. But then the article then goes on to say, and, I'm not going to read it all, dark clouds hang over this life or death struggle. Western weapons continue to be slow in arriving. There are still no combat planes. Political strains increase. Although President Biden, who will mark the war's anniversary in Warsaw on Tuesday, has provided the lion's share of arms and aid to Ukraine, both he and NATO have been too cautious in confronting Russia. And then we hear a lot of things about how the West should ramp up even further its support. But then, to continue, the wider debate concerns how this war ends. What exactly is the Western democracy's endgame? There is as yet no agreement. Future scenarios include a Ukrainian victory or a 1917-style Russian collapse, total defeat for Ukraine, escalation leading to direct NATO conflict in Europe, expanding warfare across the country, or a frozen conflict, in effect a stalemate, similar to the situation after Russia's 2014 invasion of Crimea and the Donbass. Only the latter could lead, hypothetically, to the negotiated settlement many Western politicians and analysts must eventually be attained. Admission that, in other words, Ukraine, some people in the West are now accepting that Ukrainian partition is now becoming inevitable. And then the Guardian finishes, any such future peace plan deal would necessarily involve painful Ukrainian concessions. It would be seen by many in Kiev and Europe as a betrayal, and by Putin as a vindication. That is a dreadful thought. Dreadful to the Guardian, but we are not there yet and may never be. Right now, both sides are intent on strengthening their positions through military successes. So the war goes on, and that's how it ends. The war must go on because we can't face the dreadful thought that Ukraine, as part of the peace deal, Ukraine may have to be partitioned. We don't, of course, talk about the Minsk agreement, which provided a pathway before the war to preserving Ukraine in its post-2014 borders. The Russians had only claimed Crimea up to that point. Let me repeat again. This entire war has arisen because Ukraine refused to grant autonomy to Donbass, as it agreed to do in the Minsk Agreement, and as it was required to do in a UN Security Council resolution. And the Western powers were not prepared to put pressure on Ukraine to carry through its international legal obligations, to fulfill the Minsk Agreement and to act on that UN Security Council resolution. But you will never see anybody in the British media, at least the mainstream media here, ever point that out. But anyway, now people are talking about partition. The Guardian has to face the fact that that is a dreadful thought. It is looking at various alternatives, and it talks about a 1917 scenario in Russia. Why that would be a good thing, by the way, given how 1917 ended up for the West, I really don't know. But anyway, the Guardian seems to think that might be a preferable outcome. But of course, the alternative might be a total defeat for Ukraine, a total escalation leading to a direct NATO-Russia conflict in Europe, or the alternative is a stalemate leading to this dreadful outcome that we're speaking about. None of these prospects look at all attractive. And of course, we are here, let me reiterate again, because Plan A, or shall I say the expectation, that there would be a Russian implosion following the sanctions, the expectation that was rife at the time of the Munich Security Conference last year has simply not been realized. So they're now facing all of this difficult, very complex situation. They're left with all sorts of difficult prospects, and they don't know what to do. And you could see that also in the words of the Western leaders there. We've had Scholz, as I said, he's spent most of his time criticizing other European governments, other European leaders, for the fact that they're not delivering the tanks they promised, despite the fact that they put enormous pressure on him to supply Ukraine with tanks, which he didn't want to do. So he's now going around saying, well, look, you put all that pressure on me, and at the end of the day, you're not really up to doing it yourselves. We have Macron saying we're not going to achieve regime change in Moscow. That was a disastrous and hopeless idea. I told you so. Something which, as I said, is going to make him even more unpopular with his European friends and the Americans. But there it is. That's what Macron is doing, even as he tries to ensure himself by stepping up arms deliveries to Ukraine and telling everybody that we must press on until some kind of mythical Ukrainian victory. The weirdest statement of all has come from British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, because he says that what the West needs to do is double down. I mean, he's actually used those words. Now, when people are winning, they don't talk, in my experience, about doubling down. They only use that expression about situations where someone is losing and is reinforcing failure. They're doubling down. After all, as I understand it, I'm not a gambling person, but I understand the expression comes from gambling, perhaps from the roulette wheels. I'm not sure about this, where people go on putting more and more money on the number that they hope is going to turn up when the ball is spun. I mean, I'm not sure about that, by the way, but I suspect that is where that expression comes from. I've always assumed that was the case. So it's using an expression like double down, I think, is Sunak's way of communicating his doubts. Yes, he's going along with everything. He's talking the talk about Ukrainian victory. He's telling everybody we've got to go on providing Ukraine with all the support it needs. But he uses this word, this expression, double down, which strongly suggests to me that privately he thinks the opposite. Now, I said this about Sunak, that I've never felt that he's been as engaged and as committed to this conflict as his predecessor Boris Johnson is. And that might beg the question of why in that case is Sunak continuing with Johnson's policy. Well, there's a very short answer. The factional struggle within the British government continues. It's clear to political observers in London that Johnson remains unreconciled to the fact that he was pushed out of the premiership, the Prime Minister's position last year. He and his acolytes, who include the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, are plotting for a Johnson comeback, and they're pushing hard against Sunak. So Sunak doesn't want to be seen to be soft on Ukraine because he knows that that is an unpopular position with some Conservative members of Parliament. So, of course, he is positioning himself, he's taking the same hard line as Johnson is, whilst at the same time telegraphing his doubts by talking about doubling down. I have to say, I think this is a pathetic spectacle, and you can see why the reporter from Politico is talking about Munich being nervous and the end of the world as we know it. But this is where the real big player, Wang Yi, comes into the picture, because he has apparently said that on the anniversary of the start of the current phase of the conflict, the fighting, on the 24th of February, China is going to publish a written statement setting out its position. Now, I don't think this breaks any new ground. It's been reported in multiple places as China preparing some sort of peace plan. I haven't read Wang Yi's statements to suggest any such thing. He's just going to set out, or China's going to set out, in writing, in a single document, its overall position. But merely, apparently, floating that idea has been enough to create the equivalent of a nervous breakdown amongst all of the other people, the Western leaders present in Munich. And to get a sense of how agitated they are by what Wang Yi has been talking about, I'm going to go to an article in the Financial Times. It was, in fact, when it was published, the lead article in the Financial Times. And even though it's behind a paywall, on this occasion, I'm going to read it in full, because to my mind, it gives an extraordinary sense of the kind of hysteria that has gripped the Western leaders, a hysteria born of that nervousness, that sense of failure that the reporter from Politico was talking about. And the article starts blandly enough Chinese peace proposal on Ukraine provokes Western skepticism. As I said, I'm not aware that the Chinese are making a peace proposal. Perhaps they are, but as I said, as far as I understand it, all Wang Yi is saying is that China is going to set out its overall position in writing in a single document about the conflict. But anyway, we then go on to read. Wang Yi told the Munich Security Conference on Saturday that China was not directly concerned in the conflict, but was not standing idly by, and would soon publish a position paper on how to find a political solution. He said it would be based on principles already laid out by President Xi Jinping, including territorial integrity and the sovereignty of all countries. In an apparent reference to the Russian army's occupation of Ukraine's Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, Wang also said China opposed attacks on nuclear power stations. That is inverting reality, because what Wang Yi is, of course, talking about is the Ukrainian shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The Financial Times is trying to twist it round. It's trying to make out that Wang Yi is talking about the Russian occupation of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is, of course, not the case. The Financial Times has, like most of the Western media, not all of it, by the way, but most of the Western media, has tried to avoid a straightforward admission that Ukraine in the past has shelled the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. That, by the way, appears to have ended, but that's a discussion for another day. And then it goes on to say, the article goes on to say, the Chinese initiative is expected to be unveiled in the coming week around the February 24th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then it becomes really interesting. Western leaders expressed concern about Sino-Russian cooperation. Kamala Harris, US Vice President, said Washington was troubled that Beijing had deepened its relationship with Moscow since the war began. Any steps by China to provide lethal support to Russia would only reward aggression, continue the killing, and further undermine a rules-based order. Well, the Chinese, of course, are opposed to the whole idea of a rules-based order. So if it undermines it, if Chinese weapons to Russia undermine a rules-based order, well, Kamala Harris has just given the Chinese an incentive, if you think about it, to do precisely that. But anyway, I'm going to come to this issue of Chinese arms sales to Russia in a moment. Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, said the West would be skeptical of a Chinese peace initiative that called for an immediate ceasefire. Where is that suggested? Where is the suggestion that the Chinese are going to propose an immediate ceasefire in this position paper? The Financial Times quotes him saying, who doesn't want guns to stop firing? Except we have to be incredibly wary of the kind of traps that can be set. Traps? What traps? What traps is he talking about? What are the Chinese doing which is different from what they have done before? They've issued many statements about the conflict in Ukraine. This latest position paper that they're due to publish, it looks like it's simply going to repeat much of what they've been saying already. And then Blinken goes on to say Russian President Putin might decide that because things are going badly for him, his best bet is to call an immediate ceasefire and create a frozen conflict. He will never negotiate the territory that he seized, and meanwhile he will use the time to rest, to refit, to rearm, and to re-attack. This is a response to a Chinese ceasefire proposal which, to repeat, has not yet been made. And then we go on to read US-China relations and the threat posed to European security by Russian aggression have dominated the Munich Security Conference, where senior foreign policy, defence and intelligence officials from across the West have gathered for 3 days of meetings. And then Western leaders have called on China to use its voice in the UN to condemn the war, but China has maintained a studiously neutral position. And then last year, just 20 days before the invasion, President Xi and Vladimir Putin struck what they call a relationship without limits. Okay, so then we go on to read again. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said of the Chinese proposal. What Chinese proposal? We haven't had one yet. As I said, this is a position paper. It's not yet a proposal. I'm not sure there will ever be a proposal. That we have to exploit every chance of peace. It's good that China sees it as its responsibility as a member of the UN Security Council to stick up for world peace. But she warned Germany would not accept the Chinese proposal if it involved a suspension of Western arms supplies to Ukraine. If Russia stops fighting, then this war is over. But if Ukraine stops defending itself, then Ukraine is over, and we can't accept this. Any peace proposal must be based on the recognition of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every country. Anyway, as I said, what has Wang Yi actually done? He's simply spoken about a position paper. That's all. Anyway, the follow-up after this article was that Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, made a hysterical claim, I say hysterical, about the fact that the United States now has evidence that China is engaged in providing lethal aid to Russia for its war in Ukraine. In other words, China is supplying Russia with either weapons or something that will enable Russia to produce more weapons. Western supplies of weapons to Ukraine, that's sacrosanct. Baerbock has said to us, if the Chinese say that you must stop doing that, well, that's a non-starter. But Chinese weapons to Russia, well, that, of course, is completely unacceptable. Anyway, the reason Blinken is saying that, and it's clear to me from his comments that he has no actual evidence that anything like that is going on, is because he also is panicking over the suggestion that Wang Yi might be coming up with some sort of paper or position paper which deviates from Western orthodoxies on the war in Ukraine. And why is all this happening? Why is there this extraordinary, excessive, neurotic reaction to Wang Yi's very, low-key statement that China is preparing a position paper setting out its views about the conflict? Well, there are a number of very simple and practical reasons. There's going to be soon a General Assembly, a UN General Assembly session. Apparently the Western powers have been trying to put together some kind of resolution at the General Assembly, which they hope they can pass, which will condemn in some way the Russian intervention in Ukraine. But apparently there's already arguments about this. Ukraine is apparently wanting some concrete measures to be set out in this resolution. There's nervousness that if that happens, countries that might be persuaded to support it will refuse to do so and will retreat into a position of neutrality. I'm taking all of these comments, by the way, from various parts of the British media, principally The Guardian. And, of course, there's clearly worry that what will probably happen, or what may happen at this General Assembly session, is that the Chinese position paper, whatever it is, whatever it says, will gain traction, and that leaders from the global south will prefer it to whatever resolution the Western powers are going to propose, and that is one of the reasons why Western leaders are reacting in this incredibly nervous way to Wang Yi's comments about the fact that China is preparing this position paper. But let's put all that aside. What it shows, what all this nervousness, all this hysteria shows, is that the hardliners in the West have come to understand that in diplomatic terms, at least, they've lost the initiative. They're losing the initiative, both in terms of global opinion and in terms, of course, of what's going on in the conflict itself. The attempt to isolate Russia has been a failure. The attempt to implode Russia has been a failure. And despite what Blinken is saying, the war is not going well for Ukraine. And that is the cause of all this nervousness in Munich, this sense of foreboding that is there, because the great plan of destabilizing Russia, installing a Western government in Russia, perhaps pro-Western government in Russia, perhaps even fragmenting the country, isolating China, all of that is turning to dust. And instead of the Chinese being pushed back, finding themselves on the back foot, there's now a serious risk, real alarm, that on the contrary, they're poised to take the initiative. They're going to take the initiative at the UN General Assembly. They're going to rally the global south around whatever position paper they are preparing. That far from China and, of course, Russia being isolated, the Chinese are gaining the diplomatic initiative and are preparing to isolate the West. Well, there it is. I mean, it's an example, as I said, of the nervousness of the West, but one can also see, and it also explains, the apocalyptic headlines that we've seen in Politico. It's the end of the world as we know it. That was the headline in Politico, because for the first time, the diplomatic initiative on a global crisis has been wrested from the West. Most of the world community is mobilizing around other countries, China and Russia, and the BRICS states, and that far from this conflict consolidating Western hegemony, as some people perhaps expected, what it is doing is instead, it's acting instead as a catalyst, accelerating the drift away from that position of Western, undisputed Western leadership, which the administration, the US administration in particular, has been committed to preserving. A short time ago, during his State of the Union address, President Biden strayed from his script, made some unscripted comments about President Xi Jinping, asked the rhetorical question of which world leader would want to trade places with Xi Jinping, a bizarre point, by the way. And one of the things that struck me about those comments that President Biden made is that as he was making them, he looked visibly angry. He was actually furious. And it did seem to me that there was a discordance if President Biden really did think that no world leader would want to swap places with Xi Jinping because Xi Jinping's position was so precarious, then why was he angry? Well, we see the true reason for his anger, because as is so often the case with this president, the reality is the opposite of what he says. It is the Chinese who are increasingly making the diplomatic weather. They're making the economic weather as well as their economy reopens, and that is making the West increasingly nervous, and there's now a sense that the great opportunity to reverse the trends in international relations, the move away from the unipolar moment back to the multipolar moment, to multipolarity, that attempt is now failing, and that the rise of Chinese power, the growth of Chinese power, continues. Well, perhaps that also explains something else, because on the day before all of these statements that appeared in the Financial Times, this article appeared in the Financial Times with this extreme reaction to this announcement that the Chinese were announcing were preparing some kind of position paper on the Ukrainian conflict. I read, and it was again a headline story on the Financial Times, that the United States is now holding secret talks with Taiwan. And this is the title of the article. White House to hold secret talks with Taiwan officials in Washington. And the White House will next week hold secret talks with Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu and National Security Advisor Wellington Koo as part of special diplomatic dialogue intended to remain private to avoid sparking an angry reaction from China. And then we're going to read about how there's been this secret channel has been operating for 2 years between the United States and Taiwan. And, well, it doesn't exactly tell us what is going to be discussed. But, of course, it's a very strange way of going about having a secret meeting between the United States and Taiwan, and then broadcasting the fact of this secret meeting in the front pages of a globally read newspaper, which is, of course, the Financial Times. And the fact that this was an intentional leak is, I think, shown by the fact that we're told that 5 people familiar with the talks were the sources for this story in the Financial Times. So clearly there's been somebody in the United States wants to alert the Chinese to the fact that these meetings with Taiwan are busy taking place. Again, it seems to me a sign of nervousness, further sign of anger that the Chinese are making the running in international affairs. And to go back to Rishi Sunak's words, what we're doing is we're doubling down over Taiwan. We can't accept the change, the fact that the Chinese might be making progress in diplomatic terms, so we're doubling down. We're doubling down over Taiwan, just as Rishi Sunak tells us we should double down over Ukraine. Now, I'm going to finish all of this by going back to that first Financial Times article, the one that I covered first. It was actually the later one, but the one that commented about the Chinese peace proposal. Only, as I said, I'm not convinced that it was a peace proposal at all, because it finishes with a very extraordinary, very remarkable paragraph indeed. That paragraph reads as follows. and this is from the Financial Times, Western officials now believe the balloon, this is the famous Chinese balloon that crisscrossed the United States, may have drifted off its intended course. Biden said on Friday that he aimed to speak with President Xi Jinping to get to the bottom of the incident, although he has not specified when. But go back to that first line. Western officials now believe the balloon may have drifted off its intended course. In other words, it wasn't a spy balloon after all. It actually was a weather balloon. What the Chinese were saying, that it was a weather balloon that was blown off course by the winds, has turned out to be right. That's what Western officials now believe. I'm not saying that. By the way, I thought that it might be a spy balloon. As I said at the time, I didn't know one way or the other, but it seemed to me it was plausible that it might be. Others, Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama, went out of their way to say it was almost definitely a weather balloon. And sure enough, those people who said it was a weather balloon, who of course included the Chinese government, who of course included Wang Yi, it looks like they were right, because Western officials are now telling the Financial Times that they now believe the balloon may have drifted off its intended course. So Balloongate, the shooting down of that balloon, the shooting down of all of those other balloons, including apparently a balloon put up by a school group that may have cost all of $12, all that was just over nothing. There was no Chinese spy balloon. The whole thing was just ridiculous. It was empty, hot air. Rather like the hot air we've been hearing coming out of Munich. Well, that's the end of my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Have a very good day. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and check out our shop and buy the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And also, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.